welcome everyone, and to this talk today, which I've called "Trancing the Mind." And I think that dance is a wonderful medium for actually working with psychology, working with our own psychology, working with our own mind and our own being for purposes of healing, for purposes of development, for purposes of self-knowledge, and maybe there's a whole lot of other purposes that for which we engage in conscious dance. And so this talk is about that. It's a general talk about dance, conscious dance, and trancing the mind. So before I go any further, I just wanted to say a couple of words around something called cultural appropriation. Because the talk today is about altered states of consciousness and trancing the mind, sometimes, we think we are dealing with topics or aspects that are the prerogative of other cultures and other religions and other movements, or in other countries or other times, or whatever. And that where does this fit into modern day culture? So a couple of words around cultural appropriation is that, at the level of humanity, which is me, you, and everybody else on this planet, we do have some basic archetypes and some basic principles. And these get expressed culturally in different periods and in different cultures in different ways. So if we see, like the goddess on the left of the screen is Isis. I'm not sure, I can't remember the goddess in the African sculpture, but it is a goddess. And then we have Mary, and then we have a goddess on the right. And all of these are mother-child archetypes that are expressed in different ways in different cultures. So the archetype is universal, but the expression of it is different. So if I were to now take the Madonna and transpose it onto something else in another context, then that's cultural appropriation. But if we rather then look at the full range of expression, and if we take that away and we come back to humanity, and we come back to what is common to all of us, then we're looking at universal principles. And that's the context within which this talk and within which this work is undertaken. So I'm very interested in finding the universal principles of humanity. What is common to me, you, and everybody else, and how can that serve us? So where do these come from, and how are they legitimized? And for me, they're legitimized in two ways. The first is if something is part of the evolution of humanity. In other words, it's something that has evolved with humanity or the human species, then it belongs to the entire human species. And the other aspect is if something belongs to our biology. In other words, we can trace back the source, or we can trace back principles that relate to our physiology and our biology, and included in that is the brain and perhaps a little bit psychology, then it's a universal principle, and therefore something that each and everyone has access to in a legitimate way. And I wanted to just open with this because today's talk is a lot about altered states. And altered states, generally, we kind of associate, either with in modern culture with drugs, but in traditional cultures, we associate it with religion, where we're associated with things like trance dance or taking medicinal medicines like ayahuasca or whatever. But I'm going to approach this and look at it again from a universal principle. And I want to I've been looking at the altered states and their role in evolution and in our biology. How does it work? So on the bottom left-hand part of the screen, there's always some references, and when they, if you want to access these in a recording, you can and look them up further. But so altered states, then, as I said, we tend to think of in very traditional cultures. We think of trance dances, we think of temple rituals, we think of medicinal plant ceremonies that lead to altered states, but they are prevalent because it's something that's quite universal, and it has found expression in our modern world. There's a whole subculture around inducing altered states through dance, ecstatic dance, sometimes, perhaps most often accompanied with some stimulant, some drug stimulant. But there is also a move to access these altered states just through, through dance. But that is kind of the context of where this sits at the moment in terms of a universal principle. Before I talk more of altered states, I want to talk a little bit about ritual. And now I'm moving more into the realm of conscious dance and how that fits into what we're talking today. So when we talk about ritual, we're looking at a form of human expression. Usually it's quite rigid. There's a formality around it, and it's repeated in the same way often and often. So that's the one aspect of ritual. The other one is that it's embedded in a larger system of symbolism and meaning. Often that's cultural. And then the third one is that it actually in itself lacks direct purpose. So although there's a purpose and an outcome in the bigger sense of things, the ritual itself is not what creates something. So the ritual itself is a means to an end. So it's the purpose doesn't lie in the ritual itself. So rituals generally in cultures require a lot of energy. Sometimes they're extremely extreme rituals, which involve pain, involve a whole lot of sensory deprivation, sometimes exhaustion, etc. And without having a very obvious or apparent benefit. So there's no benefit directly when I say perhaps that I'm going to stay up all night dancing. But beyond that, there is an outcome. So when we look at this from an evolutionary perspective, there's a question that arises. So, why did people create rituals? Why do people engage in these group activities? So what's really interesting is that when we look at altered states, that you can see that there's altered states in other species as well, not just the human species. So even in other primates, in other species, birds, elephants, etc., frogs, that there are certain species that actually seek altered states through plants and through mechanisms that induce altered states in them. And then somewhere along the line, of course, we divided out, and altered states therefore come from a very deep biological basis. And in the human being, those altered states became formalized as rituals. So whatever was happening in terms of evolution and biology, as we become more aware culturally as humans, then it becomes that becomes translated into ritual. And the basic, very, very basically, those rituals then start to enhance social cohesion and to promote cooperative behavior in the human being. One of the keystones of the evolution in consciousness and of the human is our ability of social interaction and cooperation. So because we like fragile little beings that could be stomped by an elephant, we have to come together, work together, so that we can survive. So the ritual comes from a very, very basic human survival mechanism. As I said, it promotes social cohesion, and it does this through shared cultural paradigms, like a religion, like a ceremony, etc. Now, I think as I go through these, it would be quite useful to almost kind of shift the question a little bit sideways and say, like, where does conscious dance or groups of conscious dance or movements in dance fit into this? You'll right through time, there have been various movements, but I'm thinking more like specifically people like Gurdjieff, people like Rudolf Steiner, these people who came with very, very strong paradigms in terms of their philosophy and whatever, that they that had a dance element to it or a ritualistic element to it. So people who share in these paradigms then and participate in ritual or participate in activities akin to ritual promote some kind of social cohesion. So we start to identify ourselves. And for many people who, most of you are here doing biodanza, we often talk about biodanceros as a kind of terminology that we're sharing something amongst us. That once that is in place, that there will be mutual cooperation, because once you identify with a group, there are moments when it becomes more effective and more productive to cooperate mutually with the group that you identify with. We'll do that in a war situation. We'll do it to protect boundaries. We'll do it to go hunting. We'll do it to basically survive. Rituals such as dance promote that group identity. That's going to promote mutual cooperation. And now we just need to think how often societies start to before they go to war, they have war dances, for example, or before they go and hunt, maybe sometimes they have ceremonies and rituals to do that. Then the third aspect is identity fusion. So that once we begin to identify with the society we are affiliated with, or that we belong to, our own identity then becomes reinforced, because it's fused with a social identity. So I know, so I, for example, would identify as being Greek, and it becomes fused in my identity because I belong to the Greek Orthodox Church, and my parents were Greek, and we can speak Greek, and there's a whole lot of stuff around that. That's a social identity. It's different. Social identity is a little bit different to identity of the individual, but the two are linked, and they're linked through ritual and ceremonies. Then rituals are places where there is emotional arousal, which aids this process. So not all emotional arousal is like kind of rah-rah and positive. So you do have rituals that will induce euphoria, celebration, or whatever it is, but there's also rituals that will create emotions that are more about suffering. And so dysphoria, it's the opposite of euphoria. And you'll find then that people connect with these emotions collectively, and social cohesion and social bonding happens through this. So when we're all suffering the same trauma or the same story, there's an identification. So emotional arousal, either through euphoria or dysphoria, also promotes connection, and that this is done through the ritual. The other side of that is that it gives a platform for emotional regulation within the individual and within society or culture. So it becomes a buffer against strong or negative emotions that might be overwhelming. So if something is, for example, with the Bushman, if something is going wrong, if there's unhappiness in the community, they dance it out. That is the way of healing. So they will dance it, and the emotion is going to be aroused and regulated in a structured environment, in the dance, in that situation, or in other rituals. And so it can be dealt with, it can be it can be encountered, and then it can also be dissipated if it needs to be dissipated. And then lastly, the ritual is, as I said before, there's a thing called causal opacity. It means that the ritual itself is not related to specific outcomes, but the ritual leads to outcomes. So there isn't a linear direct relationship. If I will dance for 2 hours, then my grieving heart is going to be, healed. There's no linear relationship here. But if I am dancing and I'm with people and I feel held and I feel comforted and blah, blah, and all sorts of things around that social cohesion, social identity, then it may lead to the fact that then it will help me deal with a broken heart, anger, or whatever it is that might be troubling me. And a lot of this has got to do with trust. And this is a huge thing in ritual and in creating social cohesion and in creating social bonding and identity is trust. Trust in the others. We have to trust that the other people in our group believe the same things. We have to trust that in the other people in our group are going to also act in the same way that we act, and that they hold the same values, that they come from the same cultural and social paradigm. And that is quite an important aspect of this. So I've spoken quite a bit about ritual now, because I feel that, well, I don't feel, for many of us, we've been told and we know that a lot of conscious dance practice embodies elements of ritual. So they may not be rigidly following a very particular pattern or very particular practice, but there are elements in conscious dance that evoke ritual, and and the outcomes of ritual. So they will promote pro-social behavior. They promote cooperation and trust. Um, and I think that to have any effective um, um, conscious dance practice, that we need these aspects. So what happens with conscious dance, if we look at it as a ritual and if we look at it as practice that promotes pro-social behavior and cooperation and trust, it becomes a container, a safe container for healing, personal growth and development. It's because it has those elements of identifying with the, in inverted commas, cultural paradigm. If I'm going to go to movement medicine, or if I'm going to go to biodanza, or if I'm going to go anywhere else, then I buy into that paradigm. I buy into the accepted cultural paradigm by agreement. We all agree that, you know, we're going to have a platform or a level from which we operate, that we're going to trust each other in that situation to operate according to the rules, and that we're going to hold each other, trust that we will hold each other, trust that we will be doing what we should be doing in that context, and that we're going to cooperate. So that creates the safe container. Very, very critical element for effective conscious dance. So the talk today is really, I just wanted to look very briefly at altered states. Altered states are a key element of conscious dance. So there are others, there are other aspects, and hopefully, you know, in the following months, if we carry on with the Sunday Forum, we can look at other elements. But today, I just thought it would be nice to kick off with altered states, something that I have a huge passion for. And so I thought, let's start here. And so for me, altered states is about, in conscious dance, is about using these very specifically as part of the practice. And that for me was the idea of trancing the mind. If we can enchant, if we can seduce the mind and lure it away from its daily, rigid, habitual way of being, then maybe we can change things a little bit. So that's the way about it. So the whole idea does arise, for me, I mean, it does arise out of shamanic practice. But as I said before, this, even shamanic practice, is a universal principle. So shaman is a term used by this very specific group of people in Siberia to describe their religious or medicine people. It's hard to put labels onto people in different cultures, but so the shaman is very specific to a very specific culture, but it has become a universal term to describe this kind of practice. So in this context, shamanic practice is a universal practice rather than a specific practice. Shamanic practice then, and altered states, is a practice of moving away from the distraction of ordinary states of being and to move into an altered state of consciousness. That's the shamanic practice. How that is done is different in different cultures, and for what purpose it's done is different in different cultures. and the way it's described and the way it's contained in the cultural paradigm is different. Okay, so some people will talk about altered states as being the spirit world. Other people will refer to altered states as being something else. But basically, at the universal level, at the level of human universality, we're saying we're moving from a ordinary state of being into a non-ordinary state of being. What does that do? So what that does is that it disengages us from the ego, first of all, and it also disengages us from habitual patterns of behavior, and it disengages us from self-centered focus. So now the ego part is that in different practices, there are different levels of dissociation, for example, when in altered states. So for some people, it's a complete disembodiment, like soul flying or kind of out of body experiences. But basically, it is a feeling that I'm leaving this kind of normal egoic self of who I am now, and I'm shifting into something different at some level or at some intensity. And going and leaving the ordinary state of being means that I also am going to leave the habitual patterns of behavior. And often if you see people who have gone into deep altered states, they really behave in very strange and different ways. And shifting also in many of these practices, you'll see that the focus from self shifts because of the widening of consciousness, the expansion of consciousness that happens in these states. What it does also do, altered states, is that it promotes perceptual changes. So the ordinary state of being and the ordinary state of being of our brain is such that we filter the world around us through the senses. It's kind of almost like quite drastic. It's almost like that out of 100% of information that the environment is giving us, 5% we will become aware of and we will use in conscious, ordinary states of being. The other 95% goes into the subconscious, doesn't go away. It's just that we're not aware of it. And if you read some of the work of people like Bruce Lipton, they talk a lot about it, but a lot of other writers talk about it. That our ordinary state of being becomes the doors of perception, to use that phrase of Aldous Huxley. When we move out of ordinary state of being, we start to see things differently. We start to have different perception. And very often in the dance, people's senses are heightened, people's awareness is changed and heightened as well. It also alters a sense of time and space. We leave the linear paradigm of time, or not, we leave the sense and the experience of linear time, and we go into a sensation where things become timeless and sometimes spaceless. In other words, we really even lose sense of the boundaries of our body, our own body, in very, very extreme altered states. And then it promotes emotional charge. So behind my head, there's the word charge, emotional charge. It actually promotes emotional charge because a lot of the opening up of the brain centers is to do with the limbic system and the reptilian brain. So we'll get there now. So what is the altered state doing it's helping us to relate to the world in a phenomenological way. In other words, from experience rather than from intellect. So dance and conscious dance specifically assists this process. It suspends the intellectual activities of language and thinking and starts to promote non-verbal awareness and expression. Now, very often, you know, when this divide happens when we start to become very head orientated, mind orientated, you know, in the head, we forget and start to forget to feel and become aware of the other senses. But anyway, so this is, the dance is taking us from the mind into the body. And so it's taking us away from the intellectual realm into sensation experienced through the body. And this, interestingly enough, this distinction between mind and body is reflected in different areas of the brain. So ultimately, there is no distinction between mind and body. They're the same thing. It's the awareness and the connection to that awareness. So if I am going to focus on something intellectual and I put my awareness there, that is going to dominate my experience. If I move that awareness away and I move it into sensation, you know, I could easily be kind of like rubbing my hands softly together and I put my attention there. That is going to take that's going to dominate the experience. So this distinction is not real. It's a perceptual thing, and it's where the focus of the experience is happening. What happens when we shift this consciousness from mind to body, we open up creative energy. Okay, creative energy is normally comes not from the logical mind. It comes from the illogical. It's not the non-logical. I would say the illogical, the non-logical. To be creative, to be expressive, comes from a different center in the brain. It can be rationalized and sometimes contextualized logically, but ultimately, creating a work of art is not a paint by numbers exercise. It is something that comes from somewhere else. And normally it's experienced viscerally. So if we, in the dance, we're going to experience it through movement. We're going to become creative through movement. We're going to feel and experience and create something through movement. And as I said, not from some conceptual model. Okay. So this in dance, this visceral response is induced through movement, through space, and it offers us an opportunity for insight and ultimately knowledge creation. The altered states are induced through different mechanisms, in different rituals, different cultures, different situations. I'm not going to go too much into this, but the things that what I've put here are the four things that really we work with with conscious dance. The one is auditory stimulation, something like drumming. Although drumming in itself will create an altered state, but different music and different auditory stimulation will create other experiences as well. So sometimes we will use the music for emotional arousal rather than, and that'll be the route into the altered state. The next one is movement. And here, if we're looking purely in terms of inducing altered states, We find synchronized movements, in other words, where um, two or more people synchronize together and enter into a space of dance or movement which doesn't really belong to one or the other, because it now becomes something that's shared, that's grouped together. And that process of synchronized movement takes us out of our own sort of self-centered focus into that little situation where we're together and synchronized. But on our own, things like repetitive movements or rhythmic movements also can induce altered states of consciousness. Emotional arousal will induce altered states of consciousness, intense emotional arousal. And then the thing I've kind of don't have a word for, so I've just called it autonomic nervous system manipulation. And I'll explain what that is now, because it's quite important. So when we enter into altered states through the dance, through conscious dance, through the drumming or whatever it is we are using, but in our situation, conscious dance or dance practice, there are physiological changes to the brain that take place as we are dancing or as we are entering into these altered states. The first one is because we're moving from the intellectual, sort of rational side of experience, which is the left hemisphere of the brain, it allows the right hemisphere to dominate. It allows us to start to connect with the functions of the right hemisphere, like pattern making, pattern recognition, expression, and all that kind of stuff that sits on that side. So there's the shift happens so that there isn't just a left hemisphere dominance, but more importantly, it also synchronizes the two hemispheres, which is why very often when we dancing, there'll be a moment when the left hemisphere goes like, oh, I've just had an insight, or I've just realized something, or I've just kind of worked out my problem, or whatever it is. It's kind of that the two hemispheres are working together, that through allowing the right hemisphere to function, to be able to see, for example, patterns of behavior, or to see to see things from a different perspective, that it can feed back to the logical feedback to the left hemisphere through this process. The other one is to evoke a dominant tropotropic or some parasympathetic state in the brain, which is what I was mentioning earlier when I said autonomic nervous system manipulation. So altered states generally will take us into the parasympathetic connection with the limbic system, connection with the hippocampus, and those areas that are also related to instinct, related to regulation of the body, basically the more ancient part of the brain. But what's very interesting about this is that generated in the parasympathetic nervous system will be a lower brainwave activity, theta brainwaves. And what happens in an altered state when we are allowing this process to evolve is that those theta brain waves start to synchronize the other areas of the brain. So the theta brain waves start in the reptilian or ancient brain, work their way all the way through to the frontal cortex. Now, theta brain waves are brain waves that are kind of hypnotic, that are meditative, that are non-verbal most of the time. And so often in an altered state, we are incoherent. We might not be able to really talk. The other side of this, more importantly, with the theta brains, is that's where learning originally took place. For children developing from birth through to about 7 years old, their brains actually function more in a theta state. They are receptives of learning from the environment around them. So they are taking in what's happening around them, and that becomes fed into the system, into the subconscious. That becomes the learning, and that becomes the habitual way of operating. So when we are creating these theta states, we simultaneously want to be creating experiences around us that are positive. If we are looking at healing, we're going to create experiences around us that will reflect the healing or the place that we want to go to. And this is going to be fed into the system subconsciously. And there will be a reprogramming. There will be new learning taking place through this process. This is the importance of the parasympathetic, the lowest brainwave activity, and the synchronized brainwave activity. So in a parasympathetic dominance, how do we get there in terms of dance and in terms of process? In normal states, when we are operating, when there's activity in one part of the autonomic nervous system, like the sympathetic stress activation, there will automatically be an attempt to balance that out in the parasympathetic. So normal functioning will be an attempt to balance between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system so that they are always in balance. However, excessive or intense stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system leads to a breakdown or collapse of the parasympathetic nervous system. Leads to collapse. And with that collapse, the parasympathetic nervous system dominates. So if we are in, for those of you who recognize this curve, if we have an intense stimulation of the sympathetic nervous system with dancers that are activating, that are full of vitality, that are pushing us higher and higher into the intensity of a sympathetic nervous system, then automatically we were going to reach a point where we will easier collapse or go into the parasympathetic nervous system, into regression, so to speak. So it's inherent in the structure of this particular curve here. What happens in this parasympathetic nervous system when it's dominant is that there can be a reprogramming, as I said before. There can be an erasure of previously conditioned responses. So if I am in a theta state, in the parasympathetic nervous dominant state, and I'm introduced to situations that are different and positive, or even negative sometimes, if we're working with the positive, it means that it can override previous conditioned responses. It can reorganize, recreate, and what's the other word that we use? So anyway, it can also create a change of belief in that moment. Belief is more a rational function. Even though we don't see it as that, we have to consciously believe something. It can also create loss of memory, but also more importantly, it can increase suggestibility. So in the state of the parasympathetic dominance, what we receive from the outside as a stimulus or as a suggestion, we are more open to it. So all of this obviously can be used in a negative way, but we use it in a positive way, and we talk about how we can use all of this to heal, change, and help with the development of people. Okay, let me move on quickly because I'm taking too much time. So what happens in some common features of altered states is that there's going to be this perceptual distortion we spoke about, which is going to change and alter the way we think and how we are thinking about things. Is going to change our sense of time and change our sense of body image. I spoke about those earlier. So it'll create this. There'll be a loss of control. There'll be a change in emotional expression, and with it there might be a change in meaning and significance of where we are at. So feelings that arise out of this are going to be feelings of ineffability, that's being able to do and accomplish things, feelings of rejuvenation, and of course hypersuggestibility. So we want to go there. We want to use it positively. So when we take dance and we elevate dance into an experience that is going to induce emotion, that's going to have an intention, and it's going to create an altered state an altered state, although the dancer is present, we will do so through involving the whole body, the mind, the physicality, so that we can experience the world in a different way. As you can see with this beautiful image here of this beautiful woman, how wonderful she is in this altered state. Through conscious dance, through carefully constructed or structured conscious dance, it's possible to bring awareness to habitual patterns of behavior. There's suggestibility, there's moments of relearning, and we can facilitate a healing. When we talk about healing of trauma, for example, or healing psychological patterns, learn new possibilities out of this. The key here is always structured conscious dance experiences, not just any old jump around free dance. So the intention of inducing altered states of consciousness is to allow us to suspend our ordinary ways of being and transcend beyond what we know or what we hold as our own experiences and beliefs, so that we can explore the alternatives. And when the brain is synchronized with in an appropriate wave length pattern, like a theta wavelength, insights will emerge and reprogramming will occur and healing will take place. Thank you.